It shouldn't be standing. A tower of mud, 8 stories of it, climbing close to 100 feet into some of the hottest, driest air on the Arabian Peninsula. And it has held that line for over 400 years. No steel, no concrete, no cranes, no rebar, no engineer with a stamped degree. Just earth. Dug out of the ground at its own feet, shaped by hand, and stacked toward the sky until it became a skyscraper. And it does not fall. It doesn't dissolve when the rain comes. It doesn't bake the family inside it alive when the sun does what the sun does out there. It just stands there, quietly doing what the glass tower we finished last year still needs power to do: stay cool. And here's the part that should bother you. The people who design the so-called cities of the future, the zero-carbon showpieces, the ones with billion-dollar budgets and architects you've heard of, some of them have already studied this place. They've taken notes. They just don't lead with where the notes came from, because the honest version of the story is a little embarrassing for an industry that sells you a new building every 30 years. So let's do the dishonest industry a disservice and tell it properly. The city is called Shibam. It sits in a valley in central Yemen, in a region called the Hadramaut, on a rocky shelf above a dry riverbed that is not always dry. Around 500 mud towers packed shoulder to shoulder inside a single wall, housing maybe 7,000 people today. A British explorer named Freya Stark walked through it in the 1930s and called it the Manhattan of the desert, and the name stuck, because from a distance that is exactly what it looks like. A dense forest of high-rises rising straight out of the sand. Except Manhattan is barely a century old. Shibam was doing vertical living before the word skyscraper existed in any language. Now, you've probably already filed an objection. Mud. It's mud. Mud is what your kid's sandcastle is made of, and the sandcastle does not survive the tide, let alone 4 centuries of rain and flood and a sun that wants everything dead. So how is any of this physically possible? Hold that question. It has an answer, and the answer is a stack of inventions so clever that we eventually forgot they were inventions at all. But first, you have to understand what these towers were actually solving, because it wasn't a design competition. It was survival. Think about the worst of last summer, the week the air felt like a held breath. You walked into a building made of glass and steel, and the inside was somehow hotter than the street, until the air conditioning caught up, and then the bill caught up with you a month later. That is the modern bargain. We build towers that trap heat like an oven, and then we pay forever to fight the building we just built. The structure creates the problem, and a second industry sells you the cure. The people of Shibam did not have that option. There was no grid. There was no cure to buy. If the building cooked you, you cooked. So the building could not be allowed to cook you. The comfort had to be baked into the walls themselves, paid for once in design, and then free for the next 400 years. That constraint, solve it in the structure or die, is what produced the genius. And the first piece of that genius is the thing you'd never notice standing at the bottom of one of these towers, staring up. The walls lie to you about their shape. From the ground, a Shibam tower looks like a clean vertical column. It isn't. It's a trapezoid. The walls are thick and heavy at the base, and as the tower climbs, the builders used smaller and smaller bricks, so the walls grow thinner the higher you go. By the top floor, the walls are a fraction of the mass they were at the foundation. The whole structure tapers inward as it rises, like a very subtle pyramid pretending to be a rectangle. That is not decoration. That is load management. Mud brick is heavy, and the lower you are in a tower, the more weight is pressing down on you. By making the upper floors progressively lighter, the builders kept the crushing load on the bottom courses within what mud can actually bear. They were distributing structural load up a 100-foot tower by hand and by eye, working from inherited rules of proportion rather than written calculations, centuries before structural engineering was a profession with a name. The trapezoid is the reason mud can reach the height of a 10-story modern building and not collapse under its own appetite. So that solves crushing. It does not solve the other way a tall thing dies, which is bending. Push on a mud wall sideways, wind, an earth tremor, the slow settling of a foundation. Mud is fantastic at being squeezed and almost useless at being stretched. Its tensile strength is next to nothing. It cracks, the crack spreads, the wall sheds, the tower comes down. Every material that wants to be tall has to answer this problem, and the modern answer is steel rebar buried inside concrete. Steel takes the pulling forces that concrete can't. Shibam solved it 500 years early, with trees. And threaded through the mud, course after course, are wooden beams. Timber laced into the body of the wall and across the floors, tying the whole structure together so that when something tries to pull the tower apart, the wood holds the tension that the mud cannot. It is, functionally, rebar. The same basic idea, a stiff, flexible skeleton inside a strong, brittle mass, arrived at independently in earth and palmwood, generations before anyone poured reinforced concrete. The towers are not mud, they are mud and bone. Which brings us back to the objection you've been holding. Fine, it stands up, but it rains out there. Not often, but when it rains in the Hadramaut, it does not mess around. So why doesn't the whole city turn back into the mud it came from the first time the sky opens? Because of a recipe. And the recipe is older than the city by 1,000 years. It's called Kadad. It's a plaster, but calling it plaster undersells it. You take quicklime, slake it down, work in oils and fats, and spread the result into a surface that goes hard and tight and sheds water like a sealed skin. You coat the vulnerable parts of the building in it, the roofs, the faces most exposed to weather, and suddenly the soft earth underneath has armor. The rain hits the Kadad and runs off. The mud behind it stays dry and stays standing, and here's how you know it works. That same technique, that same waterproof limeskin, was used on the sluices of the ancient Marib Dam, one of the engineering marvels of the old Arabian world. And traces of that waterproofing have survived on those stones through centuries of brutal weather. These people weren't guessing that Kadad would hold. They were borrowing a material science already proven by the oldest structures in their world. They were applying a tested ancient material science to a brand new problem. How do you make a mountain of mud shrug off the rain? The answer was a skin you cooked from lime and fat. So now the tower stands, resists bending, and refuses to melt. We're only getting started because we still haven't dealt with the heat. And the heat is where the real witchcraft is. The walls are thick, not for strength now, for time. A thick earthen wall has enormous thermal mass, which means it absorbs heat slowly, all day long, and only gives it up slowly, all night long. So the brutal afternoon sun spends hours just trying to push warmth through the wall, and by the time it gets through, the sun has set and the desert night has gone cold, and now the stored warmth is exactly what you want. The wall is a battery. It charges with heat in the day and discharges it at night, and inside the temperature drifts slowly, while outside it swings like a hammer. The windows are small and they're high, so the sun can't pour in and undo all that work. And then the genius scales up from the single building to the entire city plan. The towers are packed so tightly that the streets between them are slivers of permanent shade. The buildings cool each other. Those narrow alleys also funnel what little breeze exists, accelerating it, pushing it through the city like a system of vents. Even the skyline does work. The rooftops sit at uneven heights, and that raggedness churns the wind, breaks up its smooth flow, and drags more cooling out of every gust. Thermal mass, self-shading, airflow shaping, a passive air conditioning system with no machine in it, no power running to it, nothing to break, and nothing to bill you for. Engineered into the geometry of mud and street 400 years before we decided the solution to heat was a noisy box bolted to the wall. By now, you should be feeling the thing the industry would rather you didn't feel, that this is better. Not romantic? Better. Functionally better on the specific problems we are currently failing to solve. And we'll get to who profits from your not feeling that. But the city has more secrets, and they get stranger. Where does the mud come from? Not from a quarry, not from a supplier, from the floods. The valley around Shibam runs on what's called spate irrigation. The seasonal floodwaters are channeled across farmland, and that's how the crops grow in a place with almost no rain. But the same floods that feed the fields also carry silt, and that silt is the building material. The water lays down fresh earth, the people dig it up, shape it into bricks and into Kadad, and build. And when a tower finally erodes, because it will, everything out there erodes, the mud washes back down toward the plain to be deposited again. Food and shelter come out of the same flood in the same cycle. And when the buildings die, they return their bodies to the ground that made them. It is a closed loop. The city eats the river, and the river eats the city, around and around, and there is essentially no waste in it anywhere. We invented the phrase circular economy about 15 minutes ago and slapped it on press releases. Shibam has been living inside one since the 1500s, not as a philosophy, but because there was no other way to survive. And survival is the word, because these towers were never just homes. They were fortresses you lived inside. Look at the bottom of any of them, and you'll notice something missing: windows. The ground floor and the floor above it are almost blank walls. No openings, nothing to climb through, nothing to break. Those lower floors weren't for living. They were for storage and for animals. When the city came under attack, and out there, between rival clans and desert raiders it did, you brought your livestock inside. You sealed the lower levels, and your family lived high up above the reach of anyone at street level. The home was a vertical keep, wealth and people on top, defended by a windowless stone and mud base with one door. Now stand on the roof of that keep and look across the city, and you'll see the detail almost nobody talks about: bridges. The towers, packed so close, were connected to one another up in the air by walkways spanning rooftop to rooftop, which means that during a raid you didn't have to go down into the street to move through the city. You crossed it overhead. It meant a route through the city ran above the alleys entirely, an escape web that let people move between towers and slip away without ever touching the ground where the danger was. They built a sky. So let's take inventory of what these primitive mud builders actually pulled off: vertical load distribution, tensile reinforcement, waterproof chemical coatings, passive climate control at the building and the city scale, a zero-waste material cycle, and integrated vertical defense with an elevated transit layer. That's not a village. That's a fully resolved engineering system, and every piece of it was solved with dirt, wood, lime, and accumulated stubbornness. There's one more thing, and it's the strangest of all, because it changes what the building even is. A tower in Shibam is never finished. It can't be. Earth erodes, so the surfaces have to be recoated with fresh mud and fresh Kadad over and over, generation after generation, forever. The maintenance never stops. And over the centuries, individual houses have been patched, rebuilt, replaced, raised again on the same footprint so many times that the brick you'd touch today might be only decades old, sitting in a structure whose design is half a millennium old. So is the tower 500 years old? The shape is, the knowledge is, the mud is new. It's the old riddle of the ship that's had every plank replaced. At what point is it a different ship? Shibam's answer is that it doesn't matter, because the building was never an object. It was always a practice, a thing a community does continuously in cooperation with a river. The towers are less like monuments and more like a living thing that has to keep eating to stay alive. And that, finally, is the uncomfortable part. The reason this story has an adversary, because we know how to do all of this. It's not lost. It's documented. It's standing. You can walk through it. And we abandoned it anyway. We traded buildings you maintained forever for buildings designed to be demolished and rebuilt on a schedule. We traded walls that cool themselves for glass boxes that overheat and a separate industry that sells you the cooling. We traded a material you can dig out of the ground for free for concrete and steel you have to buy from someone, ship from somewhere, and replace on their timeline, not yours. There is no money in a building that lasts 400 years and heats itself with the sun. There is enormous money in one that doesn't. That's the suppression. Not a law, not a ban. Just an economy that quietly decided self-sufficient, repairable, free-to-cool buildings were bad for business, and let the knowledge fall out of fashion until it looked quaint, until it looked like mud. And then, Very quietly, the people building the most expensive cities of the future started picking the knowledge back up. When designers set out to build Masdar, the zero carbon city in the United Arab Emirates, a flagship of what sustainable urban living is supposed to look like, the principles they reached for were the principles already standing in Shibam: compact, high density layout, narrow shaded streets to kill the heat, buildings that cool each other and shape the wind, the passive, cheap, no moving parts strategies a Yemeni community worked out in the 1500s became the conceptual playbook for a desert city marketed as the cutting edge of tomorrow. The oldest vertical city on Earth, the one that beat Dubai and Riyadh and the entire concept of the skyscraper by centuries, turned out to be the prototype, not a relic. A blueprint we walked away from and are now sheepishly photocopying. It's still out there. 500 towers of mud and wood and lime on a rock above a riverbed, cooling themselves in the sun, holding their line. A tropical cyclone flooded the city in 2008 and toppled some of them outright. The rest were patched, recoated, and kept standing. Because that's what they do. They've been answering the question in the title this whole time. How were these built 500 years ago? And the honest answer is that none of it was ever actually lost. Which is where this stops being a story about a city you'll probably never visit and starts being about your own house. Because the physics doesn't care where you live. A heavy earthen wall stores and dumps heat the same way in Arizona that it does in the Hadramaut. And people are building exactly that right now. Not as art installations, as houses they sleep in. It has modern names. Rammed earth, where you pack damp soil into a form and ram it down until it sets into a wall that looks like cut stone. Adobe, the sun-dried brick the American Southwest has been building with for centuries, and still writes into its building codes today. Compressed earth block, which is just dirt squeezed into bricks by a press you can roll onto a job site. Different names, one idea every time. A wall heavy enough to flatten the daily temperature swing, made mostly out of the ground it stands on that sits in killing summer heat and stays far cooler inside without a machine running and without the bill that comes with one. And here's the part the people selling you a house will not say out loud. The material can be almost free. Sometimes it's the dirt under your own feet if the soil's right. What costs money is the labor and the knowing how, the formwork, the foundation, the waterproofing, details, the specialist who's actually done it before. That's the exact inversion of the industry we built, where the material is expensive, the building is disposable, and the entire model depends on you tearing it down and buying another one in 30 years. An earth wall built and kept up right can outlast the person who packed it. It asks for almost nothing back except the occasional fresh coat. The same never-ending maintenance the people of Shibam never resented, because it was just the rent you pay a house that refuses to die. It is not magic. In a real winter, you'll still want insulation buried in that wall. You'll still spend an afternoon arguing with a permit office that has never seen one. But the thing those towers have been doing for 500 years, standing in heat that should be unbearable and staying cool inside for free for centuries, is not a secret. It is not gone. And it is not behind glass in a museum. It's just a wall made of dirt. And there is nothing stopping you from packing one yourself.